So he studies, comes in specifically because he believes the end is coming in 1975. The end does not come in 1975. Spoiler alert. This man, instead of going, oh, you guys are wrong. The end didn't come. This must be a cult. He just doubled down on it.
These are the times we will all remember. Were you there? What did you do? So what do you say? We need to clean this place up?
Thy kingdom come.
Think celestial, making the celestial kingdom your eternal goal.
Listen to me now. Listen to me now.
And he is not permitted to evaluate
innuendo, half-truths, and lies.
Go to some weak-sauce, liberal, Democrat, baby-butchering church, but do not come back to this one ever again until you repent.
Doubt is a tool of the devil designed to weaken us.
Repent! Repent! Repent!
You are listening to The New Heretics. Shame on you.
Happy Pride Month.
Yeah. Do you know
Apparently,
anybody that's like Pride or anything like that? Do you go to
not like in my personal life, but I've been Ubering a lot of people to Pride events and just involved in various festivities and stuff. Been rocking my Pride bracelet. But apparently Pride is before a crash, according to our mutual friend Jordan B. Peterson. Pulling an interesting interpretation of Pride, which has multiple interpretations.
it has to be related to the sin, right?
From the Bible, right? It has to be the sin. And got me thinking, though, are we sure that Pride does actually come before a crash? Seems to me in the world that we live in, Pride is pretty well rewarded. It almost seems like the more pride you have, the sort of more you can just stomp your way through life and get continually rewarded. And then by the time it actually catches up with you, you're so rich or powerful, it doesn't really matter anyway.
Yeah, you could say that like the spirit of the world would be like a spirit of pride. I guess that's the thing, right? I think part of it is maybe there's like some baggage with like prosperity gospel going on with that, which is like, if you do righteous things, you'll be rewarded. But I think like the biggest insight with like even like Socratic philosophy or some strands of Christianity is that like I mean, like this is where I feel like Job, the book of Job is like super woke, where what is it called? Like the later part where he gets rewarded at the end. I think that's a later addition.
Yeah, it seems like an odd inclusion in a story that's about how you just sort of need to take it and not question God. Like, isn't the point kind of that it doesn't matter if you get rewarded in the end by God, or that you shouldn't be serving him just because he'll cover over everything in the end?
Yeah, like it's existential on purpose, and if you do the good thing, it's not the good thing is good. I think this is even Kantian. The good thing is good irrespective of the consequences, right? You're not expecting a reward at the end. You do it because even if the outcome is a detriment to yourself or to others, that's what makes it good. The fact that you it like it in it and of itself, it is good. It's like one of my biggest axes to grind with like Christians and like fundamentalist groups, which is like, no, if you do the right thing, you'll be blessed. And it's like, I don't think you understand what being blessed means.
Yeah, if everybody if they did the right thing, got rich and prosperous and like had sort of all of their health conditions like go away magically or something like that, would you would you really be doing and serving God for the right reason? I mean, that's the question that Satan, if that's Satan in the Job story, even poses, right?
Yeah. I mean, you see it with the rich guy. I don't know if he was a prince or not, but he goes up to Jesus and he asks him, like, what do I need to do? And Jesus tells him, you need to uphold the commandments or whatever. And it's like, I already do that. And then it's like, okay, well, let go of your things and come with me. He tells him, like, you need to get rid of everything. And then, that's when he gives him the weird look. And it's funny because it's like, it's not enough to just be doing the right thing. And I think sometimes people also see that with, like, doing the right thing, like faith without fruits is dead faith. But it's not just that. It's like faith invokes a certain restriction of the passions, which involves sacrifice, which involves asceticism. So you cannot, like, definitionally, you could not possibly be a Christian. And this is in layers. I wouldn't say like every Christian needs to be poor like a monk, but like you can't strive for richness out of your own fruition and then expect to be like a good, virtuous Christian.
It seems counter to the Gospels and to Jesus' teaching overall.
Because overall, like you would be degrading the practice of virtue and like seeking your own gain, right? You're essentially, like you said earlier, you're basically fostering a spirit of pride, greed, gluttony, avarice. So I think it's completely not Christian to even hold any sort of sympathies towards the prosperity gospel in any capacity.
Yeah, but let's say you're in a cult, for example, that teaches prosperity gospel, or you're in a cult that teaches you that God will answer your prayers, that he'll bless sort of requests for even material gain, if you're serving him in the correct way, that he'll ultimately take care of you, that if you pray to him and ask for direction or guidance or something, he'll always make sure that something good sort of happens to you. This is what a lot of religions teach. It gives people a sense of comfort. But then you go through life, you try this stuff out. Maybe you're going through some stuff and you pour your heart out to God. You pray regularly. You feel like you're doing everything that you should be doing and something isn't right. You're not getting answers to your prayers. Things aren't working. This can cause a lot of discomfort in true believers. I think this is probably universal to all people of faith, is that they go through these periods where it seems like these deeply held truths that they hold on to and that they have even like sort of structured their life around, that they rely on to find direction. Sometimes those aren't giving them answers, so they aren't giving them answers that seem satisfactory. And this causes this sort of mental discomfort. This is sometimes referred to as cognitive dissonance. It's really kind of the first step in the waking up process when you have any kind of strong ideology or worldview. When that worldview gets challenged and confronted by the real world, and it's just not adding up. There's something off. Things seem like either there's something wrong with your beliefs or there's something wrong with what seems to be the very real world in front of you. And this causes dissonance, right? It causes, like, if you think about it in music, when the music is clashing and it's sort of like the sounds don't sound right together. There's a disunity, a disharmony. It's really uncomfortable. It's unsettling. That has to be like resolved in music, or you'll turn it off pretty quick if it goes on for too long. Or if any of you saw Dunkirk, he goes for about an hour and a half in that movie with dissonant sounds, and it's incredibly disturbing. That's what makes that movie feel so uneasy. But eventually that has to resolve somehow. And that resolution process is kind of what determines people's realities, like how they try to like marry these cognitive dissonances they have, that the things they expect about the world that aren't happening the way they expect them to happen. and your brain has to do something with that.
I think with like cognitive dissonance in general, at least when like growing up in a high control group / cult, I think when cognitive dissonance pops its head up, you are indoctrinated to suppress those feelings or suppress those thoughts. And to kind of tie it twofold with like the prosperity gospel, right? Because they always teach make the faith your own, or if you just follow these steps, be spiritual and pray and yada yada, then you'll have access to the spiritual paradise, or you'll have access to God's grace or something. So it's always
a lot of these groups will literally tell people that they'll be taken care of even physically. God's not going to let you go without, things like that.
Yeah, that's a good one. Though, to bring up an example that's fairly common, it's like, God gave the Israelites manna in the desert, right? And it's like He literally made it rain bread so that they could eat, so that they could have their meal. And like,
does bread come down as rain or snow? I've always wondered that. Yeah, if you could have had a camera like on the manna as it was like materializing through, was it like a process, or did it just like pop into existence?
It was the process of transubstantiation.
That's right.
No, but I mean, yeah, that's it's one of those things where it's like, He won't, in quotes, God, He won't let you go through hardship, or and then there's like the seeming contradiction that if God does allow hardship, it's not it's a hardship that's not so great that you cannot bear. And so there's always these seemingly, how would I put this, convenient texts that are taken out of context, and they're used to both foster an attitude of reliance on the organization or in the cult or on the membership, which is, well, you rely on us to have your sustenance, you rely on us to have your faith, you rely on us to have your community, etc. But at the same time, when things are dysfunctional, it's never the cult's fault, it's never the organization's fault. It's never, oh, we don't provide robust theology, we don't provide actual psychological care for our group members, we don't actually care if they're materially like fiscally independent. All of that is tied to individual shortcomings. So you're just not spiritual enough, you don't pray enough to God, you're not doing enough. Are you lazy? Are you maximizing your time in theological matters? It's always an individual's fault as to why they're not being either spiritually or materially prosperous.
Right, and it has to be your fault, right? Because the cult, sort of by definition, is teaching truth, like objective, absolute truth. So if you're following what they're teaching, then things should be working for you, right? And if they're working for a bunch of other people, just look around the congregation, right? Like, look around the church. Look at all the people being blessed. Look at all the people that are happy, right? Their lives are going well. Something's going on in your life that's not working correctly. You need to look inward. You need to figure out what's going on. And this really causes like a form of personal, sort of a constant self-gaslighting that you're doing. And this is obviously relevant to the issue of doubts, because really what happens is for everybody in any kind of encompassing worldview, you're going to have periods of cognitive dissonance. You're going to have times when the things that you believe butt up against the real world. Something has to give. There's something that seems true about the real world that is not aligning with what you expected to have happen, or what you think, or something about the way you think the real world works. Or when I say real world, I should clarify, I'm talking about like things you're observing with like your senses, the sort of empirical realities around you that aren't aligning with this sort of belief system that you have that is sort of residing maybe in a more metaphysical space. But I think everybody in a cult goes through a period where they start having these doubts about maybe it's doctrine, maybe it's whether the cult is actually being guided by Holy Spirit or by God or by some sort of divine forces, depending on the kind of cult we're talking about. In the case of Jehovah's Witnesses, our background, it was believed that the governing body receives divine, they won't call it inspiration, that they receive divine direction from Jesus. They never clarify what the difference is between those two things, really. It's unclear how they receive direction without having some kind of inspiration, especially in matters of like interpreting text, which would be open to their interpretation, unless they're receiving some kind of divine intuition or something, feeling, insight of some sort that would be directing them to interpret the text differently than they want to naturally or something. Because the real purpose of a cult is to keep people under control and keep people in the cult and keep them furthering the interests of the cult. There's going to be just realities that cause you cognitive dissonance as you try to maintain this loyalty to the group despite these outside pressures and questions and doubts and things flooding in. And so in order to maintain your loyalty to the cult, which is the ultimate thing that is the most important thing to a cult, and the thing that you're being ingrained to believe is like really like the only thing that matters in life is remaining loyal to this group of people, then it opens your mind up to do all sorts of mental gymnastics, come up with all kinds of faulty reasoning. I referred to it in a thread the other day as headcanon, which is a term that I picked up from like fandom spaces. So like if you're like a Star Wars nerd, for example, and a new movie comes out and there's something in the new movie that like seems to contradict with the old movie, right? Fans will generate like a headcanon. They'll generate like a way of thinking about the story that kind of makes both of those things make sense, even though it may have very obviously been like an error that the writers made or something like that. But in order to keep this suspension of disbelief that you need to really be absorbed in like a fantasy world or like a sci-fi, like fandom or whatever, people will just sort of massage these issues away, right? They'll come up with explanations. And I think cults are doing the same thing all the time. I think people are constantly having these things that are butting up against their belief system. And they're constantly having to defer to the cult as the source of truth, accuracy. And when they do that, they're having to invent sort of their own personal headcanon to make sense out of these things. And that almost becomes like their own version of the religion. Or like you were saying, this idea of like making the faith your own or making the truth your own, as we used to say as Jehovah's Witnesses, right? It's like one of everybody's like favorite songs, right? It was like, make the truth your own. I'm not going to sing it. I'll spare everyone. But everybody's already singing it in their head probably that was raised a witness. What does that mean, right? The truth should be like making the truth your own is like, well, just sort of twist this to make it work for you. Like ultimately that's really what happens, I think, especially when you're raised into the organization, I think.
Yeah. To touch on a couple of things. One, I didn't attend an English Kingdom Hall, so I don't actually know the word.
Oh, okay.
Or at least I wouldn't know the song. I wouldn't be
able to make the truth your own. I said I was going to sing it. There you
go. But and then in terms of like what you just said, yeah, I mean that's you're definitely hitting it on point there with the way that you call it headcanon, the way that the headcanon kind of contextualizes your cognitive dissonance to, I think in psychology, what is it called? You're like suppressing the cognitive dissonance and becoming more reliant on it itself. Like it becomes like a positive feedback loop.
That's interesting. So is the idea almost that like the more cognitive dissonance you're experiencing, the more true your beliefs must be? Because like, I don't know, in the case of being a witness, it's Satan's world. So Satan's world is designed to make you like constantly like question your beliefs or something like that. And so the more doubts you're having, almost like it's like a self-reinforcing.
Yeah, kind of like a litmus test of like, if I'm having doubt, it's because I'm not, in quotes, I'm not X, whatever X is. It could be like I'm not spiritual, I'm not dedicating myself hard enough for whatever reason. And so because you're not those things, it reinforces the attitude that, oh, I need to try harder, right? So then you try to, like in like therapy, like in psychology, they tell you like to create the positive narrative, right? So it's not necessarily that you, how do I put it? You're not trying to, you move past trauma by contextualizing it under a positive narrative and then making that trauma work for you. That same thing kind of happens with cognitive dissonance, except it's like a negative aspect, right? So you use the negative discomfort to kind of try to push yourself out of that, but it just spirals downward because you can't use negative emotions to kind of fortify anything like constructive, so to speak. It will always go towards the downward spiral. So by always being in this spiral of, well, I'm not spiritual enough, so then I'm gonna try even harder, but then I still have this cognitive dissonance, so maybe I need to try harder, or I need to do this thing, or maybe I need to change the way that I dress, or maybe I'm just a pathetic nobody, and so it's just this downward trend of absolute negativity. And because it's this downward spiral of negativity, you're never going to reach your own, in quotes, it's really the cults, but your own standard of what a good cult member would look like, because you're always putting yourself in reference to the idealized version of yourself, right? So like the person that doesn't have any doubt, the person that wakes up and does all the motions and is like happy about it. And then you see that and you compare it to like people even in your vicinity, and you're like, man, how do they do it? How is it possible that they don't have any doubt? Because you always see the outward appearance, right? You always see how people interact in the Kingdom Hall or in church or out in ministry,
where everyone always has their best face on. They're always trying to be like sort of toxically positive, right? Like it's almost a sign of weakness if you show any kind of, or like a sign of like spiritual weakness if you show any kind of like vulnerability. Now there's this phenomenon I started noticing kind of toward the end as I was waking up, that when people would share, so at Jehovah's Witness meetings, for those that don't know, there's a lot of question and answer stuff that happens. So there's a lot of like Bible discussions that are sort of question and answer based. You read maybe a passage of the scriptures and then questions are asked about them, or you read something from the organization, questions get asked about it. Basically, the most spiritual people typically in a hall would be people who would keep their answers confined to like stuff the organization has said or written kind of specifically. And then there would be like a couple people in every hall who would like, every time they commented, they would give like these personal anecdotes or like share something from their life or whatever. And at least in my experience and like all of my kind of collective friend group and all the kind of elders and people that I hung out with, that I grew up with, there was always this kind of collective eye roll when people would do that. And there's always this kind of like, we'd make fun of the comments afterward, or like, oh yeah, did you hear Nancy's comment again? It was almost like you would think that like these kinds of personal expressions that people like sharing their what they're actually going through personally and trying to open up to the congregation and like this discussion setting should be encouraged. That should actually be the bulk of what probably people are commenting on, because a lot of times these scriptures are fairly, or the biblical like principle or whatever that was being addressed was fairly straightforward. You know, it's not like it needed like a ton of like peeling away at all the contextual references or the Greek or whatever. A lot of times it's a fairly straightforward idea, and really it's in the application where there's something interesting to discuss, or like how this affects people's actual lives. But anytime people actually would discuss their actual lives and show some sort of vulnerability, it was like a sign of spiritual weakness or something, or a sign of somebody being crazy or unhinged.
Yeah. Yeah, it's never about like actually making the faith your own and sharing it like with a community, because like you said, it's always people, like there's always room, how would I say this? There's always going to be like gossip, right? Or like even like judgment with some of those things, because like you said, the standard is what the organization, what the cult has established, and that's going to be their one-liners from the magazine. So it's like, it's like you said, it's fairly like superficial, like corny stuff. It's just like, make the faith your own. You need to be good. It's like, okay, yeah, like that's
rely on Jehovah. Like, what does that even mean, right?
Exactly. Something I wanted to kind of go back and touch on was the I mentioned about this cognitive dissonance spiral, but another thing is just that, I mean, even like with wherever you kind of see this, like it just kind of like pops up and everything. But like even like in philosophy, there's like some ideas by like Hegel, for example, that's like, he calls it the cunning of reason. It's the way in which, for example, something is viewed through the lens of ideology. And a really good example, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't seen Dune, would be how someone may see like a prophetic message play out empirically in real life. And there might not be any real prophecy actually playing out in real life. It could just be a made up conspiracy, or it could just be some made up narrative, right?
A lot of prophecies are so vague that they're going to be applied in, any way somebody wants to apply them, basically.
Yeah. So the purposeful vagueness of some theological texts kind of alludes to this. But the cunning of reason is that you always contextualize those things post hoc or after the fact. So I have a good example in the film, and again, spoiler alerts if you haven't seen it, would be like, I'm not even going to use characters because I don't want to ruin I mean, by this time you should have seen the movie, but if you haven't
seen Dune, go see it. Jeez. Well, go. I guess you can't go anymore, but yeah.
There's some scenes in the film where a character does something, and one of the other characters, I can say his name's Stilgar. He keeps going, it's as it was written, or as it was foretold, and then goes, basically says, that's the Messiah. And it's interesting because you see that attitude with a lot of cults, or a lot of like fundamentalist groups, which is they'll apply this, you called it earlier, like this headcanon, right? They'll apply that headcanon to the way they interpret facts. So the facts, in quotes, could be objective, but the way that they puzzle those facts together is after the fact. And it's always going to be in line to what their headcanon, their narrative, allows them to construct in a way that reaffirms the teachings, that reaffirms scripture, or whatever the organization has said at that time. And you get this a lot with, like, at least in the context of Jehovah's Witnesses, you get this a lot with the notion of New Light, which is they flip-flop on interpretations. So something in the past may have been wrong, or something in the past may have been allowed, then it becomes wrong, or it becomes antiquated, or it's not quite the right interpretation, and then they either may go back or change their mind and then reintroduce it as a new change. So it's always then contextualized from the framework of we're adapting or we're evolving. At least with Jehovah's Witnesses, I'm being specific here. They have a mechanism in their theology that allows change to be an integral part of the theology, even if it doesn't make sense, even if it doesn't have like logical credibility or any sort of like common sense. The fact that they have that in their theology allows them to kind of flip-flop on these issues with minimal cognitive dissonance.
And now, for reasons known only to the poet himself, a heretical haiku by Nick Barron.
Psh, the sky's not blue. That's the devil within you. Repent and see truth. Yeah, so just to put like a concrete, sort of give like a concrete example of how far this can go in somebody's mind, like how much they're willing to swallow and headcanon away. A mentor of mine, probably my number one like kind of spiritual mentor as a Jehovah's Witness, became a Jehovah's Witness in like 1973, I don't know, it was a couple of years before 1975. Now, the reason that's relevant, if you aren't a witness, or even if you maybe are a witness and you haven't heard about the 1975 stuff, because I think that's probably true for a lot of newer witnesses. The organization for, I don't know, some 6 or 7 years before that had been basically prophesying that the end was going to come in 1975. They wouldn't probably have referred to it as a prophecy. They believed they were using different kinds of Bible math to arrive at 1975. And maybe one day we'll do like a whole episode on that or something, because I think it's a pretty interesting deep dive and a look at how Jehovah's Witnesses in particular try to interpret the Bible. But point being, a lot of people that had been raised around the organization, and also in the 70s, there were a lot of people getting involved in cults for some reason. There's probably a bunch of interesting sociological things to look at there. There was obviously a lot of social upheaval, Vietnam, we're kind of on the tail end of Vietnam War. You see just a rise in just a lot of kind of fringe behavior, people joining cults, a lot of like serial killers. There's kind of like things were fraying sort of at the edges in society. So you see this influx of new witnesses, and a lot of them were hippies, people drawn to the certain kinds of messages that the witnesses were anti-war and stuff. But in this case in particular, my mentor had been raised around the organization. His brother had stayed in it. He had kind of drifted. But his brother was like, dude, the end is coming in 1975. This is it. You have to come in right now or it's over. Like, that's your chance or you're going to die. And he believed him. They studied. He became a witness. Apologies if I call it coming into the truth. It's just a bad habit I just have to get out of. I know it's triggering to a lot of our XGW listeners. I kind of use it. I mean, I'm also using it ironically at this point, but it's just like in my vernacular. Anyway, so he studies, comes in specifically because he believes the end is coming in 1975. The end does not come in 1975. Spoiler alert. This man, instead of after the year passed, going, oh, you guys are wrong. The end didn't come. This must be a cult, or this, must be a false religion of some sort, or at least the people in leadership. Like, there needs to be some accountability for this, what amounts to a false prophecy. He just doubled down on it. And so his explanation, some 30 years later, to me, was that he believed that Jehovah either he directed the 1975 false prophecy because he knew it would be so helpful to bring people into the truth, or he allowed it to happen because he knew it would be so effective at bringing people in. Now, if you just think about, like, what that does to your theology. If you believe God is willing to lie to humans just to get them to serve him, you are essentially, you're essentially making Satan's argument for him, for one thing, depending on how we interpret Genesis and Job. But it also means, how can you have faith in sort of anything? Essentially what it comes down to then is all your faith is believing whatever the organization tells you, because whatever the organization tells you is definitionally true, or like will ultimately be in your favor, because even if it's wrong, even if it's a lie, somehow that's coming from God. And so you're literally willing to believe anything. At that point, like, there is no falsifying of your beliefs. There is nothing you can learn about the organization. There's nothing they could teach. They could literally change every teaching they have, which since 1975, they've changed like half of them. And you will continue to just follow that. That is definitionally a cult, in my opinion, where there is no way to falsify these beliefs. There is nothing they can do that's going to make you doubt or question, and no matter what they change or what they teach, you will continue following them blindly.
like that type of attitude formally is a form of fideism, which is a technical term, if you want to call it that, or definitionally, fideism is like absolute faith. So in contrast to certain, you could call them denominations in Christianity, like Catholicism or Christian Orthodoxy, faith and reason work together. That's kind of like the best way, the quick and dirty way that I can kind of formalize that, is that faith and reason work together. But something unique with the Protestant Reformation was the emphasis not just on something, there's these 5 informal, you could call them theses or ideas, which are what are typically called the 5 solae or the 5 sola. One of the ones we've talked about on this podcast previously is sola scriptura. Another one is sola fide, or faith alone. And it's interesting that you mentioned your mentor, who it's like, no matter what, really, he's going to believe what he's going to believe, and is always going to, after the fact, reform his worldview to match his belief. So the belief, in a sense, comes first, and then everything that he needs to do after that to make it coherent, that comes after the fact. The belief is what's unchanging. Everything else is, you're kind of free to play with. And that's kind of that's kind of a general attitude of like strong fideism, right? Which is like, it's faith to the degree that it subordinates and even kind of destroys reason. There's no room really for reasoning, except that it can help you construct a explanation or a narrative after the fact, because faith supervenes that. Faith is kind of the stronger sentiment. It's faith in God, or faith in his organization, faith in his appointed apostolic body, whether that be the governing body or the prophets in Mormonism, what have you. That is the nature of fideism. And it's kind of twofold, right? Because it's faith in God, but it's also this is kind of where it ties into other systems like empiricism, which a lot of people wouldn't make that connection, right? Because we usually make the connection with empiricism with like scientific inquiry or evolution or science in general, which is...
Do you want to just define empiricism just so...
Yeah.
And for anybody not familiar with some of these terms?
Generally, empiricism is just like the attitude of like the belief that knowledge comes from the senses, or that we can form knowledge from experience, something like that. That would be like the vague general idea. And you can clearly see why this is important in the sciences, because if science relies on experimentation and observation, then it has to be the case that you have to derive all of your theories or all of your experiments or conclusions from these observations. So that's why kind of one of the central underlying, you could call it dogmas of science, is empiricism. And it's kind of a general attitude of our age, right? A lot of people call themselves like empiricists or skeptics, and skepticism has a long tradition in both rationalism and empiricism. But people who typically in our day and age, in the Anglo-American context, when they call themselves skeptics, what they mean is, I'm skeptical of mysticism, but I am implicitly or explicitly a empiricist. I won't believe in something until I see it, or I won't believe in something until we have good evidence to believe.
I can test it or sense it or something in the physical realm.
Yeah, and then even more consistent empiricists will be like, well, maybe I don't have to do that, because then that's how you get flat earthers, where it's like I have to physically see the evidence or the experiments, which is taking that attitude to its ultimate extreme. But some people will say, well, I defer to the experts. The experts have done the experiments. You can see how in the context of faith, there's still empiricism. And like I said, a lot of people don't really see this attitude, or maybe they don't see this connection. But there's faith in empiricism, because what do you experience when people say, or what do people say when they say, what do people mean when they say they had a spiritual experience, or they had a insight in faith, or they had a revelation? Someone like Joseph Smith, who had said that they had divine revelation, that's a form of empiricism. That's observing something. That is like something coming outside or even from the senses to guide one's faith. Mormons do this a lot. Mormons will always defer to, well, it seems real to me. And it's like, oh, so you're trusting your own internal faculties of understanding to form your faith?
Right.
And then
but which they can feel like is empirical. They can feel it strong enough internally or whatever that it feels empirical to them. Yes,
exactly. Or it's like, well, why do you have that faith? Well, I've seen these things happen in my life. I've prayed. I've done this. I asked God if he sent someone to my door that would be enough for me to prove that God is real. And even it could be happenstance. It could be that 2 Christian missionaries just happened to be in your neighborhood as you prayed about that last week. Next thing you know, they're knocking on your door. That could be 100% a coincidence, by all means and purposes. But people will take that as a tenet for their faith, right? So there's a strong sense of empiricism to strong fideism. It's just that the faith itself, whatever that looks like, will overpower like other faculties of understanding. So like reason, I guess even like empiricism, right? Because empiricism in this case, in the case of faith, is subordinate to said faith. You're using empirical faculties, or how you observe information, how you even interpret facts. You're using that to kind of supplement your faith. So I just find that interesting because we can argue about like maybe if we get rid of religion, people wouldn't have these radical beliefs, or it's like maybe religion is the bad guy, or religion, the institution needs to be abolished. And it's like, no, because it happens regardless of whether or not it's coming from a religious institution. And you see this with all sorts of other organizations, like multi-level marketing. You think people fall into multi-level marketing because they're unreasonable? No, they actually see that in other people's experiences, they have benefited from multi-level marketing, and they think that they too can be like them. And you see this with all sorts of other high control groups. So it's hijacking these other faculties and taking them outside of their context to not help the individual form a coherent worldview.
Yeah, and cognitive dissonance, and then the subsequent sort of headcanon that gets created out of it. It doesn't even have to be like an organization that you're trying to defend. It could be like your family. I mean, this happens all the time, right? Like you're a parent maybe, and your kid does something that seems out of character for them. Maybe you get a report from school or something, right? And parents' initial instinct will be to deny. There's no way my kid did that. There's no way he's like that, or whatever. And you start crafting like some other narrative in your head, because that cognitive dissonance, for you to accept that your kid maybe did this bad thing at school or whatever, is unacceptable. The way that would undermine your love for your child, potentially, depending on how bad this is, or not undermine it entirely, but just cause this sort of like dissonance in your feelings, right? As a parent, you don't want to have that. You want to have like pure love for your child and think they're the perfect, like almost perfect being that's ever lived. They're not going to make mistakes or whatever. And so you can see this kind of thing develop. Tribalism is sort of a similar idea, like the in-group, out-group dynamic, right? Where you sort of feel a strong loyalty to your group. Maybe you're okay with criticizing your group within the group, but when you hear criticism coming from outside your group, right, then suddenly cognitive dissonance, walls go up. We start headcanoning everything. We start justifying everything our group is doing or whatever. So this plays out in so many different areas in life, but with cults in particular, the issue is that the loyalty tends to be to like a person or like a small group of people who you just can't question, typically. In some cases, I suppose it could be like a theology that you can't question. But there's usually some group of people that are in charge of that theology in a sort of autocratic, authoritarian way where they cannot be challenged really by any of the normies in the group. And then in those cases, the issue is not this touches on another thing that I think we'll probably end up doing quite a bit of discussion about in the future, but that it's not that these people who think this way, my friend in his justification for 1975, that's not an illogical defense of 1975. It might seem crazy. To me, it's illogical. In his mind, because he presupposes the truth of the organization, then if that's just a grounding principle for him and he believes that 100%, like to give that belief up would completely destroy his world, right? So he's not going to destroy his world over something silly like a messed up prophecy about 1975. Like, oh, well, like, who cares? We'll all move on, right? That to him doesn't seem like some kind of earth-shaking news that needs to be like make him give up everything else in his life. And so he has to come up with something that seems logical to him, or logical in using some form of logic to make this work. Now, other witnesses have tried other kinds of logical explanations, logic in quotes, right? Another explanation for the 1975 thing is that nobody would really, like, the organization didn't really teach that. It wasn't like a formal teaching. It was sort of a theory that kind of developed from some people in the organization, and it kind of spread and caught on, and some people kind of bought into it. And the people that really put a lot of emphasis on dates and things like that, they kind of fell away, and that just was a sign of their weak faith or whatever. Now we could get into there's an actual factual issue there, which is the organization did teach it. They published specifically that the end was going to come in 1975. Brother Franz, a very prominent person in the organization, specifically talked about the end coming in 1975. My dad was told he would never graduate high school. He was going to graduate in like 1977 or 1978, I think, from high school. He was raised being told that. So like the people that, if they're being honest, there are people who lived through that time and they'll tell you that it wasn't really a thing. That's still a sort of way. Now their brain may be like reinventing history, but to them that's still at some point you reinvent history long enough in your memory or to solve these cognitive dissonances, and then that just becomes your memory, just becomes the way it actually was at the time. And so they're still using like a form of logic, and so this is like the danger of thinking that you can logic people out of these beliefs, or that if you just make the right argument to your like family member who's still in, that they'll wake up. If somebody can go through something like 1975 and not wake up, if they can go through like the organization changing teachings about like the generation that Jesus said wouldn't pass away, they've changed that doctrine like 13 times or something in their history. They change it every few years. They've changed it like 4 or 5 times in my life, like from times that I was studying the Bible in depth. What are you going to tell them? What kind of logical argument can you really make that they can't like use a different set of logic to explain away? And that's why logic alone really isn't what wakes people up typically, or it has to come from something internal.
Yeah, no, that's all. You brought up a lot of points that I kind of want to touch on. The first one is like logical motivation, right? Which is like, you mentioned the example of your mentor figure who, at least seemingly or like at first glance, his reasoning seems logically sound. And one of the things that I kind of push back on is when, it's like, oh man, like you mentioned this already too, but when people say something like, oh, these people believe these crazy things, and it's like they're just holding all these inconsistent beliefs and blah, blah, blah. It could be the case. Let's just grant that it could be the case that they're being logically inconsistent. That doesn't matter. The motivation for them to make that logical move to say, I need to prove this, is what's important to them. So what I mean, if something happens which would undermine their pillar for their faith or for their belief, it would undermine their system. So they need to kind of basically create headcanon or create something to fortify that or reconstruct it or recontextualize it in a way that still proves their belief is sound. So that's like
right. So like in the case of 1975, if you were to say like, oh, the organization got it wrong, they taught a false teaching, then that would undermine your faith in sort of anything they teach moving forward. Right. Because what basis do you have to believe that the next thing they teach you is right? So the easier move for them to make logically is to try to figure out a way to justify 1975.
Exactly. So there's that like motivation to kind of, and basically in a sense, gaslight yourself, right? To make your worldview consistent or coherent. Now, like I said, it could be the case that their belief is inconsistent. And this ties into, and I don't want to touch on it too much, and I want to caveat this by saying you can't always extrapolate certain arguments, or you can't always try to shoehorn things in where they don't really fit. In terms of worldviews, I'll just put it this way. In terms of worldviews, a worldview could be complete, and this is from Gödel. He's a mathematician. A worldview can be complete, but if it's complete, then there may be some inconsistencies within it. And we see that a lot with certain religious groups. A lot of these systems are complete, right?
So by complete, you mean like it sort of explains everything?
Yes.
Or like it's like a totally encompassing like explanation of why everything exists and why everything works the way it does and stuff. But then there's going to always be problems.
Yeah, and you see this with like mathematics, right? Because like mathematics is a complete system. So it has a certain set of laws or axioms. Those axioms are the groundwork for where all your logical deductions come from, which gives you a complete system. But what Gödel proved is that you can have a complete system, but it may be inconsistent. And then his second incompleteness theorem was the incompleteness theorem. If it's incomplete, or you can have a consistent system, so you can have this like beautiful courthouse of reason, right? You can have this beautiful thing. Mathematics looks beautiful, but when you go down to its foundations, it's incomplete. So what he means by that is that you can't actually prove that your system does the thing that you're trying to prove that it does. So it's just at the very
So it's
bottom.
like based on certain assumptions that you have to make outside of the system. The system itself can't prove maybe a foundational assumption that it relies on.
Yes, exactly. And that's like super common with a lot of like logical systems. So what am I trying to get at with this analogy of, or using Gödel's incompleteness theorems? You can do that with like any belief, really, or any complete logical belief, which is to say, if it has any inconsistencies, you'll just kind of like either ignore them. And this is true for like any worldview. It's not just like theological beliefs. You may have inconsistent beliefs and you can just ignore them, or you can see that there's something in your system that shows like there's a gap. Something's wrong here. I've gone to the foundational level and there's a gap. And that can be a real cause of cognitive dissonance. So what the cult member will do is they see that gap, and instead of choosing the gap, instead of saying like, well, this is a bunch of BS, right? Like in the case of your mentor, they'll double down. And so they'll do something to make their system consistent. So they'll be like, no, well, this is a complete system. I have the truth. So right. Then what I'll do is I'll just, whatever inconsistency it has, I'll just change those things. So I'll just kind of reinterpret the narrative so that it's consistent. And you see this across so many fields. You see this in the field of mathematics. You see this in the field of psychology, science, any field. So
politics.
Politics. So I'm just kind of bringing this up because I think that there's a caricature of like cult members or people who are susceptible to these things are dumb. And it's like, no, they're not dumb. We have good reason to believe that a lot of these things parasitize on people's in general, like people's cognitive abilities. People don't want to go through the hardship of being wrong or that their beliefs are inconsistent. People rather suppress that and say, no, like it's not the case, or I can prove that it's correct, or I can prove that it's consistent. People don't want to do that.
Well, and there's so much other baggage weighing on even your intellectual freedom to address these questions you have. Because in a group like Jehovah's Witnesses, you already know that if you find something you don't like or something that would undermine your faith, that you could potentially lose your entire social group, your friends, your family, the entire world that you grew up in. So like you already kind of are like baking that in to any doubt you have. Like you're sort of leaping ahead before you even address the doubt in your own mind, or you allow yourself to address the doubt in an honest way. You're already assuming what would happen if that was true. And so that already makes you reject it before you even actually literally consider what the doubt really is and whether there's a good reason for holding it.
Yeah, that kind of goes into kind of like a segue, which is, I think, how to treat doubt, right? So we talked a lot about how like doubt is generated, and you touched a little bit about this, how attacking someone's belief or it doesn't matter how good your argument to kind of deprogram someone's cult thinking is, because there's no way to do that in a way that deprograms someone. And what I mean is that there's no perfect logical argument that they can't integrate into their belief, right? It's kind of like your mentor had a clear example, had a very specific case where it's like, this is what we're basically prophesying. It doesn't come into fruition. I double down and say, no, this inconsistency was here to kind of push my faith forward, or push my belief forward, or to make to kind of teach us a lesson about something. So it's always internalized. Cult members will do that. Cult members will see, well, like you'll in quotes attack them. You'll show them like, hey, read this Bible verse, and then like look at the context, and then blah blah blah. Or do you think that the governing body is spiritually directed? And it's like, well, they say they're not, and then look at this. They changed their mind about this. Clearly, they can't have the truth, because the truth can't contradict itself. They'll just see that as an affront or an attack on them as individuals. So if you are going to attack a belief, you have to find out what the pillar or what the motivation for that faith is. So what do I mean by that? If you are going to try to deprogram someone, which I don't recommend, because again, you could put that relationship in jeopardy. We might have like a whole separate episode about what we mean by like passive apostasy, or
right.
or like a what would you call, like
more activist approach or something?
Yeah, like activism, or like anti cult apologetics, or whatever. Mm-hmm. We'll probably go into that later on. But if you do go after someone and you want to attack their core belief, you have to attack the core belief. You can't start explaining how their worldview is inconsistent with science, because they already don't have the same conception of science as you do. So it's not going to work under that framework. If you try to go through the route of like matching the worldview, let's say you're going to attack their Christian worldview using another Christian worldview or paradigm, that's going to create issues, because they may have a different set of assumptions about how the Bible was written, how the Bible functions, than you do. So you can't really always use that tactic, because at the end of the day, they may just be like, well, I believe the word of God. I believe that this was written by God. And so really, I don't find anything of what you're saying convincing. So what I mean is, when you attack the core belief, if you can sufficiently deconstruct that belief, if you can make it seem like there's an inherent contradiction in the core belief of that person's faith, then you can topple it. Now, it's really hard to do this, because that leads to the ultimate kind of cognitive dissonance, which is existential dread. Right. Because if you destroy that, then that person basically becomes like, well, this isn't the truth, then what is, right? And they can spiral really fast from there.
And because you've been so ingrained to believe you have the only view of truth, then it becomes often there is no truth, is where your brain goes pretty quick.
Yeah. Which is kind of and I can't speak for everyone's experience, but at least on the interviews that I've heard, it seems to be like a lot of people's experience, right? They see something, or they see the thing that breaks their faith, whether it be child sex abuse, whether it be the testimony in a internal investigation of one of their cult leaders, whether it be firsthand assault or abuse, whatever it may be, whatever shape or form that takes, that thing which completely undermines the pillar of their faith, that's something that they have to go through first. You can't force it, is what I'm trying to get at.
And it can take a long time.
Yeah. Like, I mean,
I think I was in the process of waking up for like a decade and a half. I mean, I really think, like, going back to at least college, I was really having serious doubts that I was working through. And I went through a period where I was disfellowshipped, and like for a number of years it was real hard. I talked about that some. That's where I started waking up. I think, and it took me, and then I even went through a period where I doubled down on being a witness and went like all in. I was like the best witness I ever was. After I got married, got out of college, there was like a 5-year period there where I was like all in. I was like, that was the most PIMQ period of my life. But I still think the doubting process had started. And as I kind of moved into this PIMQ phase, that was almost me like trying to address my doubts. It was like, I'm going to go all into this thing. And as I got all into it, I found it empty. Like the more I got in, the deeper I got in, instead of having the impact that it made me feel more and more like this was the absolute truth, it just raised more and more questions in my mind. But that just took a long time to work out.
You were trying to like pan out a sinking ship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that's the case for a lot of people. I mean, deconstruction or deconversion can take, like you said, it can take a decade. It can take a lifetime. Some people don't get out until they're in their 70s, 80s.
Yeah.
In some cases, it can be really fast. It can be a matter of weeks, right?
And if you ask those people that like are in their 70s or 80s who leave, I think a lot of them will tell you they had doubts all along the way. They probably went through periods where they almost left even when they were younger, or where they had real serious questions.
Mm-hmm.
There's just certain things that it's just like, why? Yeah, what is it that happens to a person that gets them to actually honestly address those things at some periods in their life and not others?
Yeah, I think the thing that does get them to address those issues is the motivation, right? So, it's creating spaces in which they can express those doubts, because they're not going to find any of that inside the organization. It's always going to be outside. And there's always going to be moments of inquiry, right? There comes a point where what the organization is telling me is no longer sufficient for me to suppress these feelings of doubt at some point. And whether or not that's looking at online forums, reading a book, seeing something on TV, seeing something in the news, going on social media, whatever that looks like, there comes a breaking point in which they have a motivation to start seeking information outside of the group. And so I think a way that we can, and I'm not typically one to advocate for activism for various reasons that I won't go into right now, but or at least it's hard for me to define activism, but one of the ways that we can create like concrete spaces for activism would be to create, even if they're virtual spaces, if they're concrete spaces, just outlets in which people can express their doubt. That then becomes a way for them to be able to deconstruct at their own pace, or at whatever pace they may be comfortable at, their beliefs. And I think that's very important, is to foster that environment, because, for example, in my situation, my parents always fostered a certain, you could say, air of doubt in our household. My parents were converts. They were adult converts. And so we were very much culturally ingrained in the organization or in the church. but they always fostered an air of doubt, like, hey, maybe you should question these beliefs. And I know that this is super uncommon, like this is probably unheard of. But I think because of that, I was always going to then be like, well, I don't think this is the truth. I can't make the faith my own.
I wonder actually how common this is even for multi-generational witnesses like me, because my dad put a lot of the seeds of doubt into my head. I think I've talked about this before. My dad was a longtime elder. Not totally sure if he's still an elder. My parents have kind of stopped talking to me about anything going on with the organization, but I know they're having some much more serious doubts now, and I think they're in their own waking up process right now. I think that's pretty clear to me. I don't know if they understand that that's what's going on with them. But my dad had just a lot of cynical views about the organization from growing up in it and from his own experiences as a young person, obviously going through the 1975 thing, being told he would never graduate high school. Apparently, I found this out recently, told my mom when I was born that if I ever wanted to go to college, that he would totally support me. That was in the early 80s when that was just not done. And we lived in a small town in central Pennsylvania, which was highly conservative. So for my dad to be having those kinds of beliefs and thoughts in the early 80s, I think he's had doubts his entire life. And I think he did something kind of similar to what I did, where he kind of doubled down in his 40s and really tried to just go all in on the truth. The truth again. Yeah. On the system, on the beliefs. And, you know, my parents like sold everything and moved to Mexico and did, worked where the need was greater and like a foreign language. And well, they did it in English, but it was a foreign language there. So I don't think it's not even, I don't think super uncommon for like people that have been in it for generations and generations. I'd be curious to know, like, from other people listening to this, if that was their experience too, if some of the people that are like third, fourth generation witnesses, if there is a level of like cynicism and skepticism, maybe particularly from like people in their family who have been elders or are elders or have like they're you know, kind of from a line of elders, because they see a lot more of the kind of dirty laundry behind the scenes.
One more thing that I kind of want to just touch on quickly with that is that, again, it has to do with like that core belief. And I think this is something that people don't really understand, especially in our circles, which is you can't force someone to start questioning. If they are questioning, it might only be a matter of time before they either break out or, like you said, double down. But then this just either it's going to be a cycle their whole life of having cognitive dissonance, doubt, and maybe they even stay inside the organization their whole life, but they're always going to have the cycle of doubt. Like I said, it's a downward spiral that sometimes doesn't have any relief, so to speak. And in some cases, it thrusts and pushes them to the point where it creates such a toll on their psyche that they have to break out, or they have to seek something which replaces that belief. But all that to say that someone who is very, very PIMY, physically and mentally, in any group, can't just flip a switch and make them PIMQ or make them physically and mentally questioning. They would have already have a doubt which pushed them into the questioning stage, which makes them seek out these groups. Like I said, seek out either online forums, independent research. They would have had to already been feeding that air of skepticism or that air of doubt. They need to supplement that, or they would have already felt the need to supplement that. And basically what I'm getting at is that they would have already sufficiently chipped at their foundation, whatever that is, whether it was an experience with God, a certain belief, an interpretation of scripture, whatever that looks like, faith in the Bible. They would have already had to chip that enough where they no longer see it as a sufficient reason to uphold that belief.
And I can pin down my specific experience that really unlocked that for me. I see a ton of value in mythology and in storytelling and in like, I don't know if there's something related here to faith. I'm not sure. The entire idea of suspension of disbelief is really fascinating to me, and like just how different people, like even just like to enjoy watching movies, for example, you have to have sort of a level of like ability to suspend your disbelief, and some people just don't have it, and they just can't get absorbed into storytelling the same way. And I think there's just like some really interesting crossovers of faith and some stuff like that. So I don't know what to do with that in terms of like empiricism or how that connects, but I definitely have a lot of questions about consciousness and about things like how that relates to something like suspension of disbelief, and whether that's actually tapping into something like real, or if that's just sort of a state of being that we can get into for some sort of evolutionary purposes. I have no idea.
Yeah.
Anyway, much bigger topic, but
I was gonna say we should talk about that, and then because I know that you tied this into like Life of Pi. Am I getting the book right?
Yeah, about the story, like the better story, kind of idea. That this, like you can read the story one way, but he tells the story one way, about this incredible thing that happens to him, where he survives with all these wild animals on a boat, and then at the end, somebody pokes some holes in the story. There's some people that have done like an investigation into this, and they're like, well, what about this and this and this? These things aren't like adding up, like. And he basically says, okay, well, you could tell yourself the story that, like, I was on the boat with a bunch of people and we all killed each other and ate each other. But, like, which story do you prefer? Essentially. And so, as the reader, you're left pretty much understanding that, like, that's what really happened. But, like, it turns a just horrific, like, unbelievably awful, traumatic life experience of having to eat people to survive on a boat into this amazing, miraculous, like, adventure story when you make them into animals, so it's like, which story do you prefer, right? And I think that's kind of what, philosophically, that's kind of the point of the book, is like, maybe the atheist or the agnostic, like, can poke holes in these stories that people tell themselves, but, like, ultimately, what's the better story? And I don't know if it's even just from a pragmatic, like, what's the healthier way mentally to, like, go through life living, or if there's actually more truth in the other version of the story, because in some ways, right, those people did become animals.
It's like the constant battle between right brain versus left brain type things, but like doubt the intersection between doubt and faith